Thank you very much. I want to begin by firstly thanking very warmly Fabio Gironi and Muhannad Hariri for putting on this conference, which is truly, I believe, in the spirit of the UCD School of Philosophy to bridge the gap, if it's possible, between Continental and Analytic philosophy. I'm a Continental philosopher. Sorry about that. You know the phrase of Levinas, no? Every time you use the word God in philosophy, you have to say, oh, please excuse the expression. And so I'm a Continental philosopher. Please excuse the expression, but I'm very, very new, and this is also thanks to Fabio and Muhannad, to Quentin Meillassoux, and to Quentin Meillassoux' book After Finitude, which I have just read for the purposes of this conference. Very new to Meillassoux, who made me feel very new to Kant, to modern philosophy in general. So this leads me to say that my method for this presentation will not be to analyze the points or the points of unexactitude or non-exactitude between Meillassoux and the history of modern philosophy, but rather to follow Meillassoux, to accompany him as much as I can, and to see perhaps where this project, this speculative realism project could lead us. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that also. Every philosophy needs, requires, desires to invent a language. This need, this requirement, this desire is what we could call here the chance of philosophy. This chance, however, is never dissociated from an inherent risk. For, and Plato already had warned us, language always remains and already portends a danger for the edification of a philosophy. Indeed, language can at all times recall a logos, which is without relation to the intellectual vision of the eidos. This logos is that of the inspired and the enthusiasts, which seek, above all, to innovate. Their speech, in truth, is that of the divinity, which speaks through it, enjoining us to hear its voice, that is, commands us to hear the voice of a pure Phanae. It is in this sense that their speech, through its expression alone, manifests purely that which is. The essence of this logos is not founded on knowledge, nor does it rely on any eidos. It is without relation to vision, in that it does not refer to episteme. It speaks a pure and unadulterated language of monstration, without requiring the structure of dialectic or the process of rememoration to be heard or imagined. What is this pure language as such? What does this pure language show itself as? Which saying speaks purely through this language? Plato answers in the Phaedrus 265a, it speaks dissidence. With customs and its rules, it speaks non-conformity with the ordering of vision. We could even say it speaks a resistance to the logos of vision. This break with vision, and consequently with the order of phenomenality, with the realm of experience, with the sphere of representation, is the danger which this other language secretly soars over philosophy. And indeed, this danger is always menacing for philosophy and for what we have understood under this name since Plato. This danger always has been threatening and will certainly continue to remain so for the tribe, as Meillassoux says, of philosophers we are. Why so? Because this threatening danger is that of the great outside, the grandeur, which is in no manner related or relative to our thinking it, which is thus entirely indifferent to the modality by which and through which it is given to us, simply and unequivocally there, regardless of any vision or view, thought or understanding we could claim or possess of it. Philosophy has always feared this great outside, has always dreaded the eternal silences of these infinite spaces. From Plato, whose ideas at least form the possibility of thinking where this pure exteriority is cast out of the sphere of knowledge, to Hegel, who incessantly evokes the structure of a speculative dialectic capable of always and already re-engaging itself in the process of its absolute spirit, in which the outside, the transcendent other, is reappropriated within its inherent and movement of negation and negation of its negation, culminating in the comprehension of a totality where no other is ever outside its grasp. And of course, for Kant, where, as we know, is stipulated an entire redefinition of the subject-object relation, through which its meaning is never referred to the transcendence of a being beyond intuition, but rather signified in the constitutive act of the transcendental, and thus where, as Kant underlines it himself, to recognize the possibility of phenomenality is also and at the same time to recognize the thing in itself. That is, consequently, that it would be entirely misleading to see on one side phenomena and on the other noumena as two independent spheres or two self-sufficient worlds, but rather understand that both are one thing, which by us is encountered as phenomena and which is not by us encountered as thing in itself. Philosophy has always feared the threat of the great outside, as it always sought to distinguish discourse from silence, separate meaning from void, differentiate reason from irrationality, dissociate consciousness from unconsciousness, and detach the light from the night, has always feared the threat of the night, not as yet another momentary negation of light promising to return in yet another wake, not as yet another exercise in vigilance, but as a wholly other night, that night of which Maupassant wrote, Meillassoux likes very much Maupassant, of which Maupassant wrote, I quote, was of an entirely different matter, dense, thicker than the very walls of this country house, and empty, void, so obscure, so immense, that within you brush up against unspeakable events and things, and feel roaming and prowling around a mysterious and unthinkable horror. It is to this great outside, nonetheless, beyond the Ptolemaic security of philosophical correlation stretching from at least Kant's transcendental critique of pure reason to Heidegger's ontological difference and existential analytic of the Dasein, towards which Quentin Meillassoux' writing urges us to venture. To step beyond correlation, thus, and think ancestral or immemorial events whose truth remains outside our capacity to judge, whose certainty lies wholly elsewhere than within the horizon of our recognition, such is the perilous philosophical act of after-finitude. This act requires a resolute move outside the fundamental principle of both Kantian and post-Kantian philosophies. It requires nothing less and nothing more than to abandon the idea of the real, what we have termed since Kant at least as objectivity, requires that it be thought through its relation to an intelligibility capable of deploying the conditions of possibility of its appearance. Meillassoux indeed insists repeatedly on the task of philosophy to entirely redefine itself in order to address events which occurred before, which occurred as the before of any thinking, before and as the before of any need to offer or furnish for their occurrence a conscious justification or rational objectivity. The events Meillassoux seeks to address and commands philosophy to confront are certainly named, although never explicitly seized in the thinking act of a conscious subjectivity. What are these events the name of? They are the name of those events which precede, which are the very precedents to the emergence of life, that is, of a life capable of understanding them, of situating them, of objectifying them as events. These events are named the archifossiles. And they mark, that is, they utter, precisely what philosophy in its Ptolemaic obsession to confine thinking to a thinking for us cannot but disregard as a pure nonsensical self-contradiction. They mark, firstly, that being is not coextensive to manifestation, as these events occurred in a past which remains forever irrecuperable to a conscious, intentional subjectivity. Secondly, they mark that what is precedes in time the manifestation of what it is. Thirdly, that manifestation has itself appeared in time and in space, and thus manifestation is not a constitution or a donation of a worldview, but rather is itself an event occurring in the world. And finally, they mark their date, and these dates situate before any knowledge and indifferent to our appropriation of these, the origin of the universe, 13.5 billion years, the formation of the Earth, 4.45 billion years, the origin of terrestrial life, 3.5 billion years, and the origin of the Homo habilis, 2 million years. From where do these ancestral archifossiles events speak? They speak from themselves and in themselves, which also means for Meillassoux that they are produced by experimental science. I quote, "Experimental science is today capable of producing statements concerning events anterior to the advent of life as of consciousness." I close the quote. They are produced, for it is resolutely impossible for their truth to refer to that in which it is described by us. Indeed, and Meillassoux does not shy away from the nonsensical confrontation which they give rise to, they are true in that they describe an impossible real event, or again, they objectively state their impossibility to be objectified. They are objects, thus, without being thinkable objects, or again, objects anterior to their donation as objects. This is why these events confront the ontological question of donation itself, for they mark the very anteriority of the given, of objects being given to thinking or understanding. Of course, philosophical thinking, embroiled and entangled in the scheme of correlation, whereby, as we know, always and already primes the relation, the indissoluble bind and alliance between thinking and being, and through which what is, what occurs, what exists, is always for a thinking being to think, philosophical thinking cannot address or approach the ancestral archifossile events experimental science produces. It is not that correlationism cannot think these events. It thinks them, but in thinking them it destroys and annihilates, negates and abolishes precisely what these events mark. For correlationism incessantly seeks to bring back all events, all occurrences, all beings, thus, to the originary relation stipulated and constituted by the transcendental conditions of possibility of experience, through which all phenomena can manifest and appear as objects for a finite subject understanding. And in so doing, the ancestral archifossil events are subsumed as knowable objects for a knowing subject, in that their ancestrality is linked up to the transcendental unification of objectivity in and within finite possible experience, and their occurrence circumscribed in the meaningful horizon of representation posited by and for an intentional subjectivity. Kant, naturally, never imagined an object of knowledge which was not also an event for the transcendental subject, and never did entertain the possibility of an object which was not at least destined and oriented towards a being possibly capable of receiving it, and consequently of intuiting it, and finally of appropriating it within the a priori conditions of its objective experience. At most, the ancestral archifossile event can mean, for the correlationist, a certain lack or a certain lacuna in manifestation. But this is yet another reduction of the very occurrence and production of such events. Indeed, as Meillassoux marks, the ancestral archifossile event is a lack of manifestation and never simply a lacuna in our understanding of objects, is a lack of manifestation and never simply a lacuna in our understanding of objects. They stipulate in this sense a wholly other temporality than that of presence, and engage an entirely novel time than that of experience in representation. The ancestral archifossile event opened towards a diachronicity which perpetually displaces and ultimately disrupts the place of subjectivity capable of inframing its experience in the form of a subjective horizon of temporality. These events are therefore not outside temporality per se, but always and already precede the temporal horizon of presence, head the temporality as a priori form of intuition, and lead the chronological movement of the Aristotelian idea of time. They are thus of another time than our time, in that they persistently distract, take us off the track of our temporal organization of lived experience. In this sense, Meillassoux' search focuses, in order to properly address the ancestral archifossile event, on a temporality without present, which also means without the not yet present, the future, and without the no longer present of the past. A temporality thus which refrains from inscribing itself in the realm of presence, and hence retracts from its comprehension as the unification of the ecstasies of temporality as, for example, they were concentrated in Heidegger's existential analytic. Rather, Meillassoux opens towards a temporality of the past without present, that is, also a past without witness. This is why Meillassoux seeks also to reformulate the very words we have traditionally used to philosophically approach or confront the real. Indeed, thinking does not mean thinking that which furnishes or could furnish the possibility to set experience in the frame of a conceptual representation. Nor does thinking only mean thinking the unthought. It also means, for Meillassoux, thinking the unthinkable. What is this unthinkable we are called to think? The unthinkable, for Meillassoux, is the absolute. But the absolute does not mean, in Meillassoux' grammar, the affirmation of a ground or a foundation from which all events are or can be comprehended or explicated. Rather, absolute means the impossibility to claim or refer to such a grounding or founding principle of sufficient reason. Impossibility signifies here that thinking must address that which is impossible to access, and therefore that which incessantly absolves itself from being grasped and seized in the correlationist structure of intentionality or constitution of a sufficient reason, which thus transforms the very word of speculative. For speculative, following Meillassoux, does not mean that which it meant for Hegel, that is, a system through which is signified both the arche and the telos of truth, in the always necessary movement of the dialectical reappropriation of the inherent identity, self-sameness, and difference, otherness, inherent to all that is. Rather, speculative means the necessary incessant reiteration of contingency, whereby no correlation can be as such necessary, whereby no necessity can ever take hold of the real, and therefore in which and through which no entity is ever as such necessary, which entirely redefines what we most commonly know or understand under the term realism. For realism does not mean the simple assertion of an independent entity or being. Rather, realism means here the movement of a complete and arbitrary transformation of all that is, of all things, as well as of all laws, principles, norms, or even values from one instant to the other. As such, what Meillassoux calls realism is the incessant force of a becoming, always becoming more than what it is becoming, always willing more and otherwise than what is willed, and which is always prone to interrupting, transposing, transfiguring, or transforming what is into its unforeseen otherness. In this sense, Meillassoux does not hesitate to think realism as an all-powerful hyper-chaos in which nothing is ever impossible and in which all is possible, both stability and instability of the real, both perseverance of being and inconsistency of all that is, blind becoming without order and, I quote Meillassoux, which is capable even of that which it is not, fixity, static inertia, or death. These transformations of our philosophical vocabulary are not stylistic nor simply technical. They seek to elaborate a novel language, one which speculates the real instead of accessing the real. That is, they seek to formulate a language of situatedness in and within the real, without this language subverting it in a reality correlated to our understanding or representation. They seek thus to think after finitude, that is, situate finitude after the event of modernity's irrepressible desire to concentrate and reduce the real to that which is our reality by projecting thinking into the space where truth requires no one, no subject, no life, no Dasein, to experience it as truth. To situate thinking, therefore, where no one has ever gone before. No one is ever needed, and not only because no one has ever been there, but more importantly because no one is expected there. No one is ever needed there. This situation where thinking is resolutely ex-centered in the very process of knowledge, where after finitude also and at the same time means before finitude, is named by Meillassoux Factuality. Certainly, this word, Factuality, is not without recalling, at least for the French reader, Heidegger's central existential concept of facticitate, the first French translation of Being and Time translated facticitate by Factuality. Existential concept of facticitate, and the key idea to the existential analytic, where the Dasein is thrown in the world and where through angst it is called and summoned by the question of the meaning of that which is other than entities, namely the temporal horizon of being. But when Meillassoux invents the word factuality, the gesture is made to distance speculative realism from the Heideggerian correspondence between the ontical and the ontological. Indeed, when Meillassoux uses factuality, he means to reaffirm not the opening of the irreducible meaning of being, the no thing, but rather the fact that thinking, speculating the real, is always and already contingent. That is, all that is necessarily contingent, including the very principle which affirms the necessity of contingence. In this sense, Meillassoux resituates thinking in the incessant paradoxical movement of the hyper-chaos. If all that is necessarily contingent, thinking the necessity of contingency itself must always and already be necessary, which means thinking all that is as necessarily contingent necessarily marks that this necessity necessarily affirms the contingency of all necessity. Of course, this paradoxical situation requires to be explicated. For Meillassoux, indeed, the very heart of speculative realism, its desire to address the true Copernican revolution after and before its Ptolemaic reduction, that is, its task to confront the question, I quote, "How may thinking think that which can effectively be where there is not thinking?" lies and relies on coming to terms, that is, on situating thinking in the heart of this paradoxical factuality. And Meillassoux, far from giving in to the affirmation of a totality which could ground and found this paradoxality in a principle, calls here onto yet another idea, we could say an idea which furthers and aggravates the paradoxality of factuality itself, that of an untotalizable transfinite. Indeed, Meillassoux marks admirably how and why totality must be substituted by an untotalizable transfinite. Against Hegel's systematic appropriation of truth as infinite totality, and drawing now from Cantor, whose theory of sets is seen retranslated in the anti-correlationist philosophical gesture, Meillassoux marks that the elements of any set can be arranged into a series of subsets, the number of which exceeds the number of elements contained in the original set. For example, set A consists of 3 elements, x1, x2, x3. These 3 elements can be variously combined and arranged as a set of subsets. We can build, for example, the sets bracket x1, x2, comma, bracket x3, or bracket x1, comma, bracket x2, x3, and so on. The number of subsets, or the power set of A, is therefore always larger than the number of elements of the original set x1, x2, x3. Fundamentally, this entails that the power set A, that is thus the set of all subsets of A, is necessarily larger than A. And since this holds for all sets, according to Meillassoux, the conclusion marks that there can be no universal infinite set. There can be no total or whole being or entities. The alleged totality or whole is rather the transfinite dimension of infinite proliferation. Of course, Meillassoux is here faithful to Badiou, and most particularly to the latter's seminal works, Being an Event and Being an Event 2, The Logics of Worlds. Faithful thus in marking that being as such is an inconsistent multiplicity which is not a multiplicity consisting of determinate elements, that is, not given in the form of original elements. In this sense, for Meillassoux, as for Badiou before, there are no elements. For Badiou, as we know, the universe does not exist. However, there are, still for Badiou, a multiplicity of worlds. The possibility to think this double claim lies on what Badiou calls set theoretical paradoxes. Badiou argues the following. If totality exists, it would also unnecessarily have to exist as a member of itself. Otherwise, there would be a totality outside of which something other would also exist. Hence, for Badiou, the totality requires to be a member of itself. In this sense, there is at least one set which is a member of itself. However, there are, obviously, sets that are not members of themselves. This entails, according to Badiou, in the Logics of Worlds, this entails that totality consists both of sets which are members of themselves and sets which are not members of themselves. And thus, totality itself cannot exist, as its existence would entail an antinomy. Naturally, Badiou, and Meillassoux after him, do not venture into the Hegelian resolution of the so-called bad infinite in order to reappropriate the very idea of totality. This would mean to fall back into the metaphysical affirmation of a principle from which all that is manifested as meaning for a self-recognizing and self-thinking being. Rather, Meillassoux situates thinking in the very process of the paradoxality inherent in and as the untotalizable transfinite, where necessarily the necessity of contingency is itself a contingent necessity. That is, where it remains unconditionally, this is the word of Meillassoux, necessary that the untotalizable transfinite, as the principle of the very possibility of contingency, is necessary. In this sense, the untotalizable transfinite consists necessarily in the incessant and unanticipated transgression of itself, guarding and safeguarding that no one entity can ever be labeled as necessary. This situatedness of thinking in the double process of a paradox, whereby the necessity of contingence guards and safeguards the contingency of necessity, opens for Meillassoux a double ontical and ontological absolutization. Meillassoux therefore dresses the very structure of speculative realism at the very end of After Finitude by invoking an ontic-ontological distinction. What is the realm of the ontical? The ontical is the realm where all possible entity, existing in a space where it would never need to be seen or known by a subject, is contingent and thinkable in its being as indifferent, radically indifferent to thinking. What is the realm of the ontological? The ontological is the very structure of the ontical, guarding and safeguarding the stability of contingency in and within its necessary untotalization transgression of itself. The untotalizable is therefore, according to Meillassoux, not a possibility amongst others. It guards and safeguards, it maintains and sustains the necessary contingency of all possible entities. In other words, it stabilizes the frenetic modality of contingency into its inherent necessity by stating the contingency of all necessity. According to which law is this ontological structuration called and invoked in the framing of both the language and the task of what Meillassoux calls speculative realism? The law from which this distinction is marked and sourced is that, we have heard already the word, is that of stability. Meillassoux seeks to stabilize the ontological as the structuration of the necessity of contingency through the necessary contingency of necessity. Naturally, one cannot fault, philosophically, the desire to stabilize. We are, however, justified in posing the question, not critical, but question. From where does this stability establish itself? From where does this stability occur and perdure? Our question, our suspicion, lies in Meillassoux' exigency to guard and safeguard contingency in its necessity as necessity of contingency, to guard and safeguard the inherent unthought and requiring no thought realism to perdure animates the ontological distinction Meillassoux is committed to establish. However, and here would be situated our question, what is at work in this distinction? That is, what of the relation between the ontical and the ontological? In which manner does the distinction between the ontical and the ontological, posed by Meillassoux, between the necessity of contingency and the contingency of necessity, maintain the necessary stability of the entire structure known as speculative realism? It is rather surprising that Meillassoux does not seem to give voice to how and also why the ontical and the ontological relate to one another. How and why are the ontical and the ontological to correspond? All occurs as though the ontical and the ontological were fixated as two absolutizations radically separated from one another, a separation which would guard and safeguard the speculative the stability of speculative realism. Our question is thus that this radical separation subreptically reintroduces the impossibility for the ontical and ontological to relate. We could further our question or our suspicion by marking that the separation and differentiation, radical, of the ontical and the ontological absolutizations in Meillassoux certainly opens the possibility of a language. It is a language which voices everything of the real. But in voicing everything through the fixation of the separation of the ontical and the ontological, it also, here's our suspicion, it also says nothing of the real, to the point culminating that it, this language, indifferentiates undecidably contingency and necessity, levels off and out in a necessary contingent undecidability, necessity and contingency. For such is the drama of this fixated ontical-ontological separation and differentiation which maintains itself without explicating the relation, the correlation, the correspondence of the separated or differentiated absolutes. It indifferentiates undecidably the terms it is pretending to state and distinguish. Every philosophy, we started by saying, needs, requires, desires to invent a language. Perhaps speculative realism needs, requires, desires to invent a language of the destruction of language. That is, a language where no one could, because no one would be required to, think the modality between the ontical and the ontological, both contingency and necessity, and how they correspond to each other. But perhaps this is the radicality of Meillassoux' speculative realism, that the real does not need a language, and consequently, we need no language for the real. But then, what of language? What then of philosophy? Thank you very much.
Hi, Joseph. I was just wondering about, it doesn't directly, it relates to this totalization thing. And this is just a wide open question, but in various places, when he speaks of Kant as totalizing the possible, I was wondering what you thought about, it seemed like with Kant's antinomies and so on, that's exactly, that's what he's not doing. And that he's talking about any view that totalizes the possible as dogmatic and so on. Did you get it? Do you have a sense of how that fits into his wanting to move beyond the totalization and how that relates to Kant's view?
Yeah, thank you. I think Meillassoux, I mean, and again, it's more of a kind of a feeling more than a grounded justification or explication. I think Meillassoux is seeking firstly and foremostly to think that which is unthinkable for Kant. And in a very almost in a very violent manner, he is seeking, he seems to be seeking that which incessantly cannot be comprehended by any type of totality, however mobilized, however mobilizing, however incompensating it can be, however possibilizing it could be. Because in a certain manner, I think Meillassoux seeks to think a possibility beyond the possible, because he seeks to confront thinking to an impossibility, to that which retracts is even poor of a word, but refuses to enter into the domain of possible representation or experience. In a way, when I was reading, especially the first chapter on ancestrality, it really made me think of Blanchot, the French writer, philosopher, who also was constantly seeking to think the unthinkable, constantly seek to confront thinking not to the possible but to the unthinkable. Now, that's profoundly exciting in a certain manner. And I think that's the radicality of Meillassoux' thought, is that he urges philosophical thinking not to settle for the possible. He urges philosophical thinking not to settle for that which is possibly circumscribed in experience or representation. But at the same time, I wonder if he really is if he can have a language for it, if there can be a language for this great outside. Yeah.
But then you identify the possible with representable? Because it would seem precisely that Meillassoux, at least in my understanding,
Yeah.
when he says something like, I want a philosophy that only speaks of what could be and
Yeah.
never what is,
Yeah.
he wants to, like the is in that would be the representable, in a sense, or as a smaller domain of possible. The possible would precisely exceed what could be represented, and there would be a discourse through mathematics or rationality or whatever for this. I don't see where the impossibility comes in. It's just possibilities that exceed representation.
I think the impossibility comes in with what he says about donation. Remember in the first chapter he says that what he's thinking, what he's seeking to think is being as the precedence or the antecedents of donation. He's not seeking to think a being that's given, he's seeking to think being as anteriority of donation or of givenness. The impossibility, I see it there. But I agree with you that for Meillassoux, this is the speculative realist idea of possibility. That's where possibility really lies for Meillassoux. The possibility really lies in this impossibility for being, for being to simply give itself. And to see being as this anteriority to manifestation. How can we think an anteriority, such an anteriority of being to manifestation or to givenness? How can we think this anteriority? Well, we can't think it because it's not precisely, it's not for us to think. But there lies, for Meillassoux, the possibility of a really true realism. The really true realism lies in this excentering of the thinking of donation. So the link here is between impossibility as the key figure of a much more radical concept of possibility than just the possibility that would be linked to possible manifestation, possible experience, possible objectivity.
I'd like to follow up exactly the same line.
Yeah.
And it's a question, but I'm still sorting out exactly how he's taking this, but I'm wondering whether you think this might be right about what Meillassoux is doing with this very radically sort of unspecifiable possibility of anything that's an arche fossile. Whether part of what he's trying to part of what he's trying to do is point out that that same kind of unspecifiable possibility, including our possibly being quite radically wrong, pertains to any particulars that we do manage, even within or prior to human history, to identify.
Yeah.
That even if we might get some of it right, you know, look, here's part of my camera case, that even when we succeed at that, there's still this radical possibility that it might vanish in my fingers right now.
Yeah.
Is that also part of the radical possibility that you think he's after?
I think so. Yes. I think that the whole discussion of the archifossile is to liberate not the ground, but the space of this radical possibility, which could transform, transfigure the stability of the world. I think, and this is also a very radical thesis because it means that all we have done in modern philosophy in thinking the idea of possibility has not been further or advanced enough to think a radical possibility like that possibility of the radical transformation of the stability of our real reality.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm going to even be able to articulate this, since I'm just struggling so much with. But I guess I hear in what you're saying something different from what I got reading Meillassoux.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to try and, if I can, I don't know if I can do this at all. But when you say he's trying to think the unthinkable,
Yeah.
and when you said a minute ago that the archifossile is, it sounded like you were saying that's the unthinkable. It sounds like the way you're presenting it is, it sounds correlationist to me, because it sounds like you're saying there's this barrier we run up against, right? The limits of thought. I mean, so his idea is so much anti-Kantian. He's trying to construct an argument that shows this to be kind of an illusion. There aren't these kinds of limits of thought which run us up against something unthinkable.
Yeah.
And he thinks in fact there's a dogmatic presupposition in that picture, which is that you've dogmatically presupposed something which limits the extent to which you can think it, and so on. So I thought the upshot of his argument was something more like, well, the archifossile precisely is thinkable.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is figure out how it can be thinkable.
Yeah.
And to do that, we have to give up this sort of Kantian theme about the limits of knowledge, the limits of thought, and so on. And what we wind up with is a kind of rationalist optimism about the thinkability of everything.
Yes.
Right? That I'm not sure how to use the word totalize here, but I mean, totalities are precisely legitimate when they provide us with something to think. So the kind of unthinkability and impossibility is operating at a different level, right? I mean, it's a prohibition on setting limits to knowledge in the way Kant and the post-Kantian tradition has always sort of habitually done, right? But these limits are kind of illusions because they presuppose a kind of dogmatic other side that's supposed to be not accessible. I'm sorry this is so vague.
No.
But a lot of what you said sounded to me like it was reading Meillassoux in a kind of this sort of finitist, tragic, sort of Kantian mode. Maybe I was mishearing you, but I think he's trying to sort of pull us out the other end and show that was a kind of mistake and illusion.
No, but on the tragedy, I'm a tragic kind of guy, so it's I don't take it. But
maybe I misheard you.
No. I think, but it gives me the occasion to clarify. I don't think that for Meillassoux the impossible or the unthinkable is a limit. On the contrary,
right.
I think the impossible or the unthinkable in Meillassoux is precisely the liberation of what he calls the true Copernican revolution, and the limit, here I think you're absolutely right, the limit is the Ptolemaic correspondence, correlationist reduction of this radical insight of the Copernican revolution. No, his realism is not at all about any type of limitation, not even the limitation I would venture to say between an independent world and a subject. It is the liberation of a realism in which the contingency and the necessity of contingency is completely liberated. Yeah? Completely liberated. My small suspicion or question is pertaining to what language can possibly speak that. What language can possibly speak that? And especially when Meillassoux reinstates or instates at the end of his book this ontological distinction between two mathematical absolutes, the ontical and the ontological, and keeps them separated. They're different. They're radically different. But in keeping their difference without thinking their relation, what he is, and this is something Hegel understood very well, is that he is destroying the very possibility of language. He's destroying the very possibility of having to speak about, or being able to speak about the link between the ontical and the. That's why I ended on this tragic note of this no language, of this language of the destruction of language.
But presumably his answer would be that it's mathematical. That's the link.
Yeah, that's the link.
But that's not enough.
But
I mean, I don't know
yeah.
what to make of that either, but
Yeah,
that's not
right.
enough of a link for your.
No, it's not enough of a link.
Oh, okay.
Oui.
Thanks for that. Two things. One quick thing, just in your response to sort of
Taylor.
Of course, in Meillassoux, there's an important distinction between, if he's right about it, between what's thinkable and what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't say that what's unthinkable, but precisely the point of strong correlationism for him is that just because something's unthinkable doesn't mean it's impossible.
Right.
He can't do his argument without that. So he said, whether he's right about that's a different thing.
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that so you're talking about why this is a problem for language as such.
Yeah.
If Meillassoux is right, presumably because we're talking about a world somehow independent, utterly independent of language, not related to language in any way, which is basically I take to be your thesis.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you make of the fact that in all the things he says about the ultimate nature of reality, it's absolutely contingent and hyper chaos and all the rest
Yes.
of it. Now he's using words to say these things.
Yes.
So what's he talking about?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's. I didn't. I have it written down, but what are we doing here? Exactly. And maybe this explains why he is not here. But I would. But to be more focused on your question, I would say that it is not that he's not speaking. He is speaking. But his language is dismantling speech, is dismantling language. It's like it's not, Meillassoux is not so limited to say that the correlationist does not think. The correlationist for Meillassoux is not wrong. he is right within the sphere of what the correlationist does, namely reducing the archifossile or reducing those truths which are independent of our thinking them. But in thinking, the correlationist reduces. It seems to me that Meillassoux, in writing, is engaging a for the real, about the real, a radical destruction of language. Perhaps he's claiming, this is a speculation, perhaps he's marking that the real needs no language, and that we need no language for the real. We can talk about it, certainly, but every time we talk about it, we are reducing what it is.
Isn't his argument precisely that someone mentioned before Berkeley's master argument, and I think there is a bit of that in Kant, it was you, seems over one, where the problem is, how can you think something that isn't a thought without turning it into a thought?
A thought, yes.
Right?
Yes.
How can you think a tree outside a thought without always being a thought?
Making it
So
a thought.
is this the kind of problematic you're referring to? And if it is, isn't that precisely the problem he's trying to overcome by showing that thought can precisely talk about the world, or rather, not talk about, deduce the nature of the world as it is independently of us and all that.
I don't
That's
think.
deduction rather than talking
Okay.
about it.
I don't think he's trying to trick like the Berkeleyan argument, you know. Well, okay, well you're thinking it. No, I don't think he's doing. I don't think he's doing that. I think he's really making a claim about the real, namely that the real requires no language, and that every language on the real, placated on the real, is necessarily bringing with it to go very quickly, a correlationist structure of the for us. And in this sense, I think the incredible dynamic, the incredible dynamic of necessity and contingency that he sets up is precisely in the vein to mark that language can never catch up to that dynamic. That language could never, except maybe mathematical language, but language could never catch up to that dynamic. And in this sense, you cannot not say that he touches on something, because ever since Plato, language and seeing have been linked. The language and seeing, language and vision have been linked. But he wants to think events that are not subjected to the primacy of vision. And then the question, what language can be without this referent to the vision?
Catch up with the call.
Yes.
Thanks. Probably the most sympathetic talk that we'll get at this conference. So it seems like, I just want to make sure I understand. The way you've actually changed a lot of how I was looking at chapter 1 with your talk, but it seems like you end up with a problematic situation, at least the way you're explaining it. So when we want to think the archifossil,
Yeah.
the tendency is to turn it into a possible representation.
Right.
And so you want to think of it as something that could be disposed towards cognition. But Meillassoux' intention is, in this sense, you realize that he's using it as just an example. It's
Right.
theatrical. In this sense, he's not really concerned with manifestation at this superficial level. But but you end up with a problematic situation. I think this is what you're trying to say. I don't know if I've understood it. Either I'm going to think of the archifossil as a potential representation, something disposed towards cognition, or I'm going to accept that it's something that is somehow beyond that,
Yeah.
impossibly
Yeah.
disposed, and that's where you lose language.
Yeah.
And then, is this the way that you introduced the? Because I never really grasped the way he uses the distinction of ontological and ontic here. Is this where it comes in, where when you lose the language, it's the ontological, and when you've utilized the language, it's the ontic, and he says, and he really has no way of linking these two.
Yeah.
This is your question was that I'm just trying to
Yeah,
understand.
no,
all
no,
these
I
things.
think you're
So
on the right
these two
track.
things are not linked. And what you mean by there's a question. I just want to make sure I understood everything. And then what you mean by the dynamic is that between necessity and contingency
Oui.
is that on the ontological side, what you have is a necessity of contingency,
Yeah.
the unsayable, the language
Yeah.
stops. Maybe the iteration of mathematics can. But on the other side, you have the contingency of necessity,
Yes.
which is the possible representation, which
Yeah.
would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
This is the.
Yeah. And my
I never saw Meillassoux this way before.
and my
This is
my
great.
my that's very good, thank you. My suspicion, or whatever that means, is that I completely understand Meillassoux' need to structuralize this at the very end of his book. I completely understand the need that he sees to, in a way, stabilize this frenetic movement or this frenetic dynamism. I completely understand it. The suspicion is he doesn't seem to say anything about the manner in which the ontological and the ontical relate, and how they correspond. And so in a certain manner, what seems to be ex-centered is not only the correlationist point of view, but it's the very possibility of language itself. In the impossibility, now in the negative sense of the word, the impossibility that he has, or that he comes up with, of linking the ontical and the ontological. You know? I mean, it's surprising. I don't have the English version, but it's surprising when you read this it comes on the last page. It's very surprising to hear all of a sudden Meillassoux say something like dénoncer quelque chose à propos of de la structure même du possible, of the very structure of the possible, et non à propos de telle ou telle réalité possible, and not in regards to such and such a possible reality. And then further on, what I mean to say is the possible comme tel, as such, and not such and such a possible entity, necessarily must be untotalizable. It's very telling to see the radical differentiation that he places on these two orders in order to secure the stability of the whole structure. But it's very telling that securing the very stability of the structure remains riveted to such a radical dissociation. And I know he can't go to mediation. He can't do the Hegelian move of mediation. And he can't do the correlationist move of bridging with a reflexive judgment, the theoretical and the practical.
Don't you, just to follow, don't you think that the question of whether language fails, I mean, it seems like the response will be yes, language seems to fail, and that's the lure for Heidegger's move, saying, well, then it must give itself in some way. I mean, the question of language is maybe itself. I mean, why does it need to be that there is a language?
Yeah.
Or that the whole idea of primary and secondary qualities is re-emerged here because we want to talk about something that is extrinsic to language.
Yeah.
It's an iteration. So I mean, it seems like
Yeah,
You make it sometimes sound like Heidegger. It's
No,
in that
maybe,
sense.
but
There you go.
what I'm, yeah, but in a way, the I think you're right. I think his philosophical point is that the real does not need language,
Yeah.
and that's fine. It's perfect. It's, I mean, for Meillassoux, that's fine. It doesn't need a language. But I thought what you were going to say is that Meillassoux is not going to go the Heideggerian way.
Of course,
But
yeah.
perhaps this not having a language for the real means for Meillassoux, and maybe here I'm being against it, but it means for the case, the necessity to invent a wholly other
Yeah.
language. And here maybe Nietzsche would be interesting.
Just, again, to follow very briefly,
Yeah.
two other routes he's not taking, and this is part of what's so interesting about what he's doing, is he's not taking a deconstructionist approach to language. He's
Definitely.
not a purist.
No.
Right, okay,
Definitely.
but, I mean, the contrast set is a remarkable set of contrasts, and this is part of what's impressive about
Yes,
the book.
definitely. No, he's not at all. Even though he can share certain things. I said Blanchot. Even though he can
Yes.
share certain things, it seems to me with a type of. But he's not at all in the direction of deconstruction. But in a certain manner, neither is Nietzsche. So this is why the suggestion
Yes.
that maybe there is something between Meillassoux and Nietzsche that is yet to be deployed. I think that would be very interesting. Yes, sir.
Maybe this has come up in other talks this morning, but I'm just wondering why not mysticism over philosophy?
Mm.
What particular spectrum it might be.
Yeah.
I mean, if language isn't the primary form of sense making, it seems to be an attempt to make sense of language.
Mysticism. I wouldn't say. I mean, we would have to define what we mean by mysticism here, but I wouldn't say mysticism. There is something. When I think about this or when I read him, there is something in me that tells me there is a gnostic temptation. But I haven't thought that out. I haven't thought that out completely.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Meillassoux' answer is that mysticism is dogmatic. But if what you're asking is, how does Joseph's reading of Meillassoux prevent it from just being mysticism, which we know he rejects? I see. So that's what he was asking.
Okay,
Why is your reading of Meillassoux not
yes.
just a kind of mysticism, which we know Meillassoux
Yes,
doesn't want?
now I
Thinking of
understand.
Tractarian mysticism, right? That's dogmatically saying we can't say
Yes,
beyond
yes.
the limits of language. I thought that was your question. Okay.
Yes, I get it now. Well, because again, this impossibility that I'm referring to is wholly and entirely the space of the possible for Meillassoux. It is, or to rephrase it, this as I just did, this destruction of language is also the very possibility for the invention of another language. It's not just staying, he's not at all fixed or fixated, yeah, in I'm just going to abolish him. He's giving a language of non-language to the real. If that makes any sense. Because I think he's very committed to and I think he's very committed to this paradoxality. He's constantly working with the paradox. Constantly.
It's a good time to stop.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.